All right, okay. Hello, everybody, and hello, dear panelists, and especially our dear attendees, who are some of them are also panelists, and we'll hope to see your faces maybe sooner rather than later. We'll see. So today, I'm very happy. I'm Mark Lipovetsky at Columbia University, and I'm very happy to open this event that is, on the one hand, more or less traditional, on the other hand, more or less crazy, right? It is the first of all, it is the not just a seminar or symposium; it's a Zoom posium, as a reflection of our time, and also as a reflection of the format with very brief and muscular presentations, right? This event has been organized by the Harriman Institute uh, together with Anastasiya Osipova of the University of Colorado Boulder, um, and Ainsley Morse of Dartmouth College, right? And this event is dedicated to the publication of the book I'm holding in my hands, the book by Nadia Yusupova, The Scar We Know, and of course to its author, right? And this book, I should say it right away, has been published by the Cicada Press, and Anastasiya Osipova is the director, editor-in-chief, and probably the owner of Cicada Press. So it's her publication, and the editor of this book, and also the author of a very um, helpful introduction, is Ainsley Morse, uh, who also edited translations made by the brilliant team of our friends and colleagues, Sibyllin Forrester, Martha Kelly, Brandon Kiernan, Madeline Kinkel, Hilaya Cohen, Stephanie Sandler, hello Stephanie, Joseph Schlegel, and Bella Shayevich. Right, and also this book includes the introduction by a fellow poet, Oksana Vasyakina, whom you will hear today too. Right. So this book is very important for Russian literature, not only in English but also in Russian, because this is actually a bilingual book, as all books published by Cicada Press. And those of you who are following Nadia Yusupova's poetry and this publication have noticed that the reviews of this book have already appeared in major publications. I would only name Vanessa Place's review in The Guardian, which is, I think, a sensational success for the book by the Russophonic poet in English translation. It's hard to find a parallel after Brodsky, I would say. No, nothing like that has happened since then, and maybe not even then, right? So, and that's what makes this event sort of unprecedented and in many ways unique. On the other hand, it is yeah, and of course, Los Angeles Review of Books also published a very important review. Um, on the other hand, this event continues what we started last year, and Nastya was there already. We had the seminar at probably it was the last live seminar before the pandemic, which was dedicated to contemporary political poetry in Russian language, right? And where we had, as I said, Nastya, and also Dmitry Kuzmin and Henrietta Stahl, and a group of scholars, and Kevin Platt, and translators who were talking about contemporary political poetry. So, and it's only logical that now we are talking about one of the most important representatives of contemporary political poetry, and I'm insisting on this definition, Nadia Yusupova, right? And certainly the audience that we have here, and who is full of our friends and colleagues, doesn't need this introduction, but I hope that somebody else would be watching us afterwards at least. So, and it is important to give a little bit of context, right? Since the beginning of the 21st century, critics and scholars have been speaking about the uh, poetic resurgence in Russian culture, right? Resurgence that many, at least me, compared with the uh, high stakes poetry had in the 60s, at least, right? Although today's poetry doesn't have the audience filling the stadiums. Nevertheless, the sort of the mm, new poetic quality, the new type of poetry, the new type of imaginary have been developing since the 2000s, or even late 90s, and women poets played leading role in that movement back then. We had and still have, lucky to have, Elena Fanailova, Maria Stepanova, Marina Temkina, who is in our audience now, Polina Barskova, and many other prominent poets. In the last few years, so this movement that was growing and very, very strong, it gained a new power with the new group of poets such as Galina Rimbu, Oksana Vasyakina, Lena Kostereва, Екатерина Zakhariev, and of course Lida Yusupova, our today's hero, who moved forward, pushed forward the what they call themselves the feminist poetry, the poetry focusing on issues of LGBTQ plus, on issues of gender, and most of all on issues of gendered violence and gendered and sexual violence. Right? And this is truly political poetry, right? And this is truly political poetry that embodies the famous phrase from the American 70s: "The personal is political." Here, indeed, the personal is political, and this change in this turn has happened. Probably change in mentality after 2012, and I remember very well when back then there was the trial of Pussy Riot, and uh, everything was discussed, but their feminist agenda, which was completely disregarded, which was completely sort of snubbed, and the fact that they're protesting against sexism was uh, marginalized by all liberal media, or media that were calling themselves liberal. Uh, the new political poetry and the new political poetry, as represented by Lida Yusupova, is changing this quite radically. And I'm very happy that today we are having the chance to spend the entire day on Lida Yusupova's poetry. And I just again for the outside audience, I want to remind that Lida Yusupova is the author of with this book, 6 books, right? And one of them is the book of prose that she wrote together with Margarita Meklina. Her first book has been published in 1995, uh, and her book "Приговоры," published in 2020 by Новое литературное обозрение, has already received the prize of Vavilon just right now. Before that, in 2017, after her book Dead, she received a very important, in my opinion, prize, Различие, which is sort of given by a group of young critics to their favorite poets. And Lida Yusupova is in a very good poetic company there. I prepared a number of various quotations about Lida Yusupova, but I think this is excessive now, because we'll have speakers who will be doing this quite well. without me. So my colleagues are sending me angry remarks in chat that I'm talking way too long. So I'm shutting down and gladly passing the baton to Ainsley Morse with just one last word. Dear colleagues, so please either send your questions or comments in the chat, or if you want to speak up, we have this technical possibility. We can give you the floor. Just let us know that you would like to speak up, right? Just I don't know, send a line into the question answers or into the chat, and we will be happy to accommodate you. As you know, Zoom is unforgiving, and I'm shutting down, right? So presentation will be short, and panels will be short as well. So make your questions short too, right? Okay, thank you very much. And here goes Ainsley Morse, the moderator of our first panel, Sex and Violence in Yusupova's Poetry.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for hosting us. I'm so glad that we get to do this. All right, without further ado, we're going to spend the next half an hour approximately talking about sex and violence in Lida Yusupova's poetry. I'm going to start. Mark already kindly introduced me. I'll briefly introduce the other two presenters as we go. So what I want to talk about today is I'm calling it intimacy and euphemism. I'm really mostly talking about sex. And I'm going to start, I'm just going to share my screen and just have the book, actually, a shot of the book so that you can follow along. That's not what I want. Sorry, everybody. My screen share doesn't like to cooperate. Tell me, can you see the book? Yes, okay, great. So I'm starting with a quotation from the long poem, The Center for Gender Problems. Okay, I'm just going to read the Russian. It starts at the bottom of this page in English with the lines I can't describe. Я не могу описать, что произошло дальше. Я уже 3 дня пытаюсь рассказать о нашем сексе, о том, как было прекрасно и что мы делали. Но как только я превращаю свои воспоминания в слова, все становится примитивным и даже смешным, будто для лесбийского секса нет слов в русском языке. However, the following lines perform the solution to this problem of helplessness, this problem of lacking the language to describe this lesbian sexual experience. Immediately, we have a kind of solution. This passage begins with the words I write. So you see on this page, I write, я пишу, Валина пизда была чудом, ее клитор был красным, как зернышко граната, ее вагина горячей внутри, мои пальцы обладали чувствительностью, достаточной для оргазма от одного только проникновения в ее вагину. И нарастающая пульсация моей пизды стремилась туда Валину пизду. Я пишу, я не чувствовала границы между телом и телом, безграничное море, безграничный секс. Диктую на телефон, он пишет, не было границы. Мы дуры, безграничные дуры. Я пишу, я не знала, что ебля может быть такой моей, полностью моей. Это было счастье, это была самая счастливая ебля в моей жизни. Ебля счастья, ебля счастья, ебля счастья. So, the taboo words, the mat words, pizda and yeblia, are crucial to this project of inventing language to talk about lesbian sex. So as you can see in the English translation, which is by Hila Cohen, Hila chose to translate the words pizda as pussy. This was kind of an obvious choice for, well, obvious and not obvious, because in English, the much more obscene word for the same thing is cunt. And this is a word that actually almost approaches for many people like the force of mat in the extent to which it is taboo in English. And it's negatively marked. For yeblia, I think fucking is fine. Seems like the only logical option. But there is an important contrast between these words in English and Russian, which has to do with the different force of taboo language in the two languages, and also with current notions of what constitutes poetic language in these two contexts. So on the one hand, it's funny that Russian mat is based entirely around words that have to do with sex, but they are not actually an obvious resource for talking about sex. Even you do find the word pizda in sexual context, but it is not the automatic go-to word, which can be contrasted to a word like pussy, which is kind of a porn standby. For whatever it's worth, not relevant to this poem, but the also taboo word hui, designating a penis, is not used even in porn in Russian. So Yusupova has stated herself explicitly that she does not use mat in this kind of intimate speech, but that she employs mat in poetry because of its potential for expressiveness and intimacy. And this expressiveness is precise. She writes, I always want precision, sensual precision, чувственная точность. And mat in the right context, when you can find the right words and images, can concentrate that sensuality into a sort of very precise explosion. Yusupova's use of mat to talk about sex in poetry is shocking because the social function of mat is most often rhetorical aggression, and has been until recently particularly taboo for women. In poetry, mat and sex have been walled off in famous secret manuscripts or permitted in small piquant doses in formally normative lyric. What Yusupova is doing is a radical reclaiming of mat as a source of explosive expression in a specifically poetic context. It's no accident that other recent feminist poetry also uses mat in innovative ways. It adds rhetorical intimacy to poetry in part because it is code for like-minded readers. The readership of these poets accept mat beyond its traditional context and connotations, but for readers who still consider it taboo, the words retain their repellent force. And as a side note, I would say that I think there is some kind of similar mechanism here in the famous furor over the My Vagina poem by Galina Rimbu, where Rimbu was criticized probably even more for using anatomical language than she would have been if she had used mat in this way that Yusupova is doing. Both mat and very precise anatomical language diverge from the more euphemistic norm, right? So we're getting away from euphemism. So the Yeblia in this poem harks back to a related poem. Let me see, where is it? Here we go. A related poem from a few years before. This was also translated by Hilla Cohen. If you see the English, and I will read the poem in Russian. It's called «И нашу волшебную еблю». Господи, Валя, я тебя нахожу в Фейсбуке. После всех этих лет, когда я о тебе ничего не знала. Я думала, ты умерла, может быть, совершила самоубийство. А ты жива-жива и пишешь о хохлах и грязных мигрантах, и о прекрасном Путине, и обезьяне Обаме, о том, что надо бомбить Украину и Сирию, и о том, что только любовь между мужчиной и женщиной – чистая любовь, и о том, что Битлов заменили двойниками еще до убийства Ленина инопланетяне. И в 86 комментариях это доказываешь. Я помню твое тело с побритым лобком на красном ватном одеяле, белое тело, тонкое, твои маленькие груди, и все, что я в тебе так любила. Я все в тебе так любила. И нашу волшебную, давай назовем ее Ебли, и нашу волшебную еблю. At the end of the poem, the speaker performs another search for language, a brief layover in the land of elegiac descriptive lyric poetry, «Все, что я в тебе так любила», which leads her to what she really wants to remember, which is their fucking. Earlier, the poem lists the slogans and tropes of Valya's Facebook politics, which come in nicely alliterated pairs, «Прекрасный Путин», «Грязные мигранты». which is an example of how hateful speech is often infectious by design. The patchwork of bizarre belief and violent politics is arguably a central feature of social media, with the algorithms of engagement and engaging language as a source of pleasure. The speaker responds to Valya's dehumanizing rhetoric with a specific sexual memory and diffuses this divisive alliteration with an equally mellifluous "любила еблю." And the force of the mat word, this taboo word, cuts through the Facebook noise and offers its own alternative rhetorical escalation. The act is shared with Valya, but the intimate rhetoric is extended to the reader. So I'm going to just touch very briefly on something that was in the first part that I read, where the phone was doing autocorrect. So you might remember, я пишу, не чувствовала границу между телом, безграничное море, безграничный секс, and the phone is correcting it to дуры. And this comes up again in the same poem, The Center for Gender Problems. There's this whole exchange with the autocorrect. And I think that this is not unrelated to this overall project, in that you have, on the one hand, this very 21st century found poetry material with autocorrect passages in the poem. But also the phone is doing these stubborn correctings that point to the limitations dictated to language by algorithms and data sets, kind of censorship through inertia. The phone tells you what you can and cannot say and what kind of language you use. So I think that this is similar to the kind of rules that are being broken with the sort of language that you can use in poetry or elsewhere. So as a final example, I want to point to a different kind of a sort of a flip side of verbal estrangement introduced in other poems that talk not about positive sexual experience, but about sex and basically violent sexual experience, which is the point of our little discussion in this first section. So in two poems that are taking place in a kind of memoiristic space of 1980s Leningrad, Minutki and Matyuk. So Minutki here, and then Matyuk, the next one. There's what I think is a very interesting use of the word sex. So in this one, you can see in the very beginning, Рита попросила меня переспать с Кокой, у него еще никогда не было секса. And at the devastating final section of the poem Matyuk, which I show you here, the very last lines before we get into this section of just repeating это неправильно. Когда он вернулся, он молча лег на меня, и у нас был секс. And once again, the seemingly transparent language, I think, makes translation very difficult. But the way I read it, the use of the word sex here, at the time when this poem is set, a recent borrowing from English, and the awkward construction of быть секс у кого, right? У него не было секса, creates a distancing effect, even psychological dissociation. So sex is an event that happens to someone. It's a blunt object dropped into the poem, a memory that has been roped off. So there are a lot of other words for sex that could be used and aren't being used here that would sound more natural. And in my view, here we see Yusupova once again reaching for language that does not quite exist to talk, in this case, about sex as a transgression, as a crime, without resorting to the language of the law, which, as she shows us in the verdict cycle, is problematic for other reasons. So I'll stop there. I apologize, yes, if I went on too long. And Nastasya, are you next? Okay, so next will be Anastasiya Osipova. Anastasiya teaches at the University of Colorado Boulder, and as Mark already told us, is the wonderful editor and boss of Cicada Press.
Thank you so much, Ainsley and Mark. Okay, I will actually try to abide by the 5-minute limitation. We'll see how it goes. And I do have some slides. Okay. All right. So I too will be talking about intimacy and the search for language, the two topics that Lida outlined. Today I decided to focus on Lida relationships to Isaac Babil, a writer who's an author of the short story Spravka, which you might remember, that locates the experience of being initiated into writing with the experience of changing gender and becoming a lesbian. If you recall, in this short text, young Babil is having an encounter with a prostitute who then treats him like a woman, right? So to some extent, there is a bit of a prehistory of lesbian sex. Anyway, so I'll start with an anecdote. So in her introduction to The Scar We Know, Ainsley Morse recounts the following anecdote from Lida Yusupova's biography. So in 1983, Lida was expelled from the Leningrad State University, where she had been studying journalism, and instead went to work at the post office. And in the dormitory for the post office workers, she hung the portrait of Isaac Babil over her cot, and quote, the other post office girls thought that he was her father. So I was intrigued by this little anecdote, and I decided to follow up on Lida about the backstory of it. Just as a bit of a preface, I will read you an excerpt from Lida's poem called «Dead, Dead». Тело отца на полу, детализированное до последнего волоска, не спящее, а мертвое, неоспоримо мертвое, но рожденное воображением. The dead's body on the floor in detail, down to the tiniest hair, not sleeping, no, indisputably dead, but born out of imagination. So my micro thesis for you today is that the encounter between Lida and Isaac Babil and the passing of Isaac Babil as Lida's father is more than an example of post office girls' ignorance, but rather an encounter between a father and a surrogate daughter of sorts, that there is something about Isaac Babil's language and in particular his relationship to sex, violence, and also documents that Lida chooses as an imaginary source of origin, or rather as a substitute falsified father. So last week I spoke to Lida about this little story and I asked her to elaborate, and she gave me the following background. So she said that even though she enrolled in the university to study journalism, her desire was to study law. And in fact, she snuck into a class about jurisprudence, where she acquired a textbook that shocked her with its language. She said that this legal textbook was the best book that she ever read because of the cruel transparency of its language. And it was around the same time that Lida's cousin was working as a translator. Here we have this introduction of the figure of a translator who had contacts with foreigners and was bringing Lida foreign clothes that Lida would wear and that would scandalize her pedagogues. This, let's say, scandal was further exacerbated by Lida's experience of failing her exam in historical materialism 4 times and being expelled from the university. But shortly before she was expelled, a boy who was attracted to her and who in turn had an affair with the librarian at the secret closed KGB library gave her a volume of Isaac Babil as an exchange token of his affection. And it was after she was expelled that Lida started reading Babil and found in him the same intensity the same language of concentrated, transparent cruelty that she so admired about the book of law that impressed her earlier. And it is at this point that she said Babil rescued her from the, let's say, thick and all too dense prose that she was writing at the time. So all I'll do right now is merely suggest some of the possible lines of interconnections between Lida's work and Babil. And unfortunately, because of the time limit, I can't go into close reading, so I will just suggest some of the avenues for you. So the very first, let's say, almost biographical connection that unites them is the sense of otherness, of belonging to and wanting to transcend the minority culture. So, of course, as you all know, Babil was born in a Jewish family, and the trauma and the joy of acquiring Russian language and then French language is a highly stigmatized topic in his writing. Lida, in turn, was also born in the bilingual environment. Her family is half Russian, half Tatar. And she said that her maternal grandmother who lived with them didn't speak Russian at all. So growing up, Lida claims to have internalized this position of us versus them, meaning the half Muslim, half atheist household versus the rest of the Russian society. And I suggest that this experience of trying to continuously outgrow one's environment, interest in morphing, in forging and translating one's identity is something that is, let's say, a through line in Babil's as well as in Yusupova's work. Then this theme of translation unites to some extent the legal discourse, the discourses of legality and the discourse of sex. So if we think about what Lida could have found in the book about case histories, the answer will probably be an attempt to equivocate, to find the meaning to the body, right, to the traumas or to things that happen to physical bodies, and to do it in an unsentimental way. So this pursuit of equivalences, of going rates, and here it's sort of a nod to the theme of prostitution in Isaac Babil, between the body and the language is, I feel, it's something that runs continuously through both Babil's and Yusupova's prose, as well as a desire to interject the language of others, right? Babil himself, as you might know, had some brushes with with law. So for instance, in the Guide de Maupassant, the story about translation, he recalls going to the morgues and police stations in the morning to search for case histories to write about. At some point, Babil also worked as a translator for Cheka. So the discourse of law and the discourse of translation is something that is very present here. And on the right slide, I have a short poem from Lida. It's an excerpt from "I Went to Jail to Free Dario," where, let's say, again, we have the combination of all the same factors. So this poem is set in Belize, and I'll read to you the English. I went to him behind the glass. He asked who I was. I said, a writer. He asked if I had Belize citizenship. I said, no. He said, well, then you can't free Dario. I said, well, then what can I do? He said, let somebody else do it. I said, who on earth would that be? He asked, do you write in English? I said, no, I only write in Russian, but I will write in English. He said, fine. Took my ID, scanned it, brought back papers, I signed them, and he added his signature. I was able to inspect it later. What I really wanted was to find out his name, but all it said was court clerk. And next to it, a lowercase f, the print of an ant's paw. At 1:47, Dario left the jail. So you see how in this poem, the promise of translating herself into English and her announcement that she is a writer is sufficient to create yet another scene of writing, meaning signing papers, that in turn somehow translates or becomes a sufficient enough bond, almost a financial guarantee to free her friend Dario from jail. And we have this very specific mark of Dario's release. So again, this theme of, let's say, triangulation between translation, writing, trying to evaluate the worth of bodies in terms of words is, I think, something that unites Babil and Lida. I'll conclude with that. So essentially, I wanted to, again, just introduce possible lines of interconnection. And I think it's interesting and worthwhile to see, to trace this imaginary paternity, a forged paternity, between the feminist poetry of the late 20th and the first half of the first quarter of the 21st century and Soviet modernism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stasia. I will briefly introduce Nadia Vikulina, our next presenter. She is a researcher of contemporary Russian and Polish poetry and art, starting her PhD in Slavic studies at Harvard this fall. She also helped us a lot making the wonderful book that we're talking about and celebrating today, as in her capacity as intern at Cicada Press. Thank you, Nadia.
Thanks for the introduction. And can I just quickly double check the time that I have, because I know that
you should have your законные 7 minут, and then we'll just have to talk really fast with questions.
Okay. So I'm gonna speak about the poem from Rachel C4 that is actually an opening poem in the Scribe No. It's called The Sex of Rage. And I believe that in this text, Yusupova commits to the exploration of violence against female bodies that kind of taps into the conceptual territory of transcorporeality, revealing how pain that such violence incites is embedded within larger patterns of formation and destruction in the material world. Poem's images pull us in the same direction as material feminist attempts to bring the materiality of the body and the natural world into the spotlight of feminist theory and art. The poem follows a certain narrative, and I'm just going to briefly recall it so I can get my point across. So Constable S.G. Clay comes back to his town to find out that a terrible accident took place. His wife was unexpectedly injured by dogs and dies of amputation. And the later witness, Constable marrying her cousin, and poem ends with her posthumous monologue. These events unfold as a series of superimposed images: body of Margaret, stones, flowers of saxifrage, and blood. Such superimposition, blood almost mistaken for and looking like flowers, both the body and the stones being broken apart, creates a vision of Margaret's body fully enmeshed in the natural material. As Stacey Alaimo writes in her essay Transcorporeal Feminisms and the Ethical Space of Nature, material feminist opens out the question of the human body by considering models of extension, interconnection, exchange, and unraveling. And the poem is being very articulative when drawing on these models. We learn that the Huskies were an extension of body of Margaret Agnes Clay, that the body of Rosalind Water is an extension of body of Margaret Agnes Clay. Interestingly, in the middle of the poem, we encounter a piece from an illustrated history of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, so the original text that the story is coming from, and she's building her own poetic text, kind of following the same patterns of organic extension, this time building on the original document. The interconnectedness that is envisioned in a poem doesn't exist as a peaceful amalgam. On the opposite, its coherence is granted through constant and perpetual processes of broken up and tearing things apart. Plant of saxifrage crushing stones, the body and the city itself. The body of Margaret, being interwoven in the fabrics of nature, therefore is being exposed to numerous instances of violence, and the list of these instances is very impressive. Her body is being crushed by the flowers, the wind jumps at her, huskies are biting her leg, and then Constable suggests that the huskies were actually possessed by evil spirits, and then her leg is being amputated, and then her cousin since she is an extension of her body, the breaking of her hymen can also be counted as part of this list. And the range of these agencies is kind of uncanny. It is simultaneously human, non-human, and even supernatural. In the same essay that I already mentioned, Alaimo writes, by underscoring the trans indicates movement across different sites, transcorporeality opens up an epistemological space that acknowledges the often unpredictable and unwanted action of human bodies, non-human creatures, ecological systems, etc. And I find it interesting that characters in a poem are often depicted as not knowing or not being able to fully grasp what was going on. Constable Clay steps on red moss, not knowing that it is blood, and Constable Stalforthy repeats that nobody knows why it happens. And I think the poem conveys this impossibility of thinking about human body and nature without this radical surrender to its violent patterns. And then the most literal connection of her body and nature happens in the last fragment, when she is being buried and we hear her posthumous dream. This fragment is an integral part of the poem, but it starts with its own title, kind of making the text undergo a certain and enter the afterlife, and the mode of afterlife along with her body. And it makes very visible the two distinct layers of Margaret Agnes Clay that we witness. The one layer is the social layer of being a wife that is very present. Her death is announced as the death of a wife, and then the tombstone carries the saying that to the beloved wife, it is, and her death kind of transfers her to the being a saint. But on the other hand, there's another layer of her natural biological body that is being stored in this like cold, stony land. And I think her iconization and transferring to the image of a saint doesn't stop her from stating that her name will eventually be forgotten, and her social transfer to the image of a saint redeems her easily forgetting nature and her replaceability. This wife will become another wife, and the violence will enforce itself endlessly. It is her biological body that harbors the pain of the incident. I believe in this eerie image of posthumous bodily sensations that Yusupova creates in the last fragment, she points at the importance of thinking about survivors of violence, and specifically violence against women, not exclusively as social martyrs and subjects for political and social critique, but also living bodies that are constantly exposed to cruelty, whose nature is utterly contingent. And to just sum things up, I think that this poem and her work in general offers a very rich and insightful offering that helps to kind of think and reveal the active force of the human body and its incorporatedness into the material world, and gives us very interesting poetic depiction of violence that doesn't focus exclusively on culture, language, or critique, and offers a very spacious, ethical, and exciting ground to discuss violence that happens to female bodies in a larger context of our environment. That's all.
Nadia, thank you. Hurrah. Thank you to everyone. We have at least 10 minutes for questions. So if anybody who has been listening would like to put a question in the chat, or I think you can raise your hand. Yes. Yes. So you can actually just ask your question yourself. We are also welcome to ask questions of each other, and we may have some questions coming in from YouTube, I think.
And I would like to add that we have a video by Oksana Vasyakina, but we'll show it later in the panel.
Yes, we have a pre-recorded presentation by Oksana Vasyakina that we'll play for everyone at the conclusion of the third panel.
But if we don't have questions now, we may use it now.
Yes, if there are no questions, we
Let's-
can listen
let's-
to Oksana now.
Sure.
But don't hold back with your questions.
So then let me ask. All right. So
Yeah.
I have a question for Nastya, and I'm very intrigued by this parallelism between Bible and legal language, right? But knowing Bible, I would say that his language is anything but direct. It's highly figurative, right? And maybe just as, on the other hand, I'm recalling Galina Rimbu's remark that when Lida is writing her verdicts, her приговоры, and using the legal language there, right? This legal language doesn't return the agency to the victim. It doesn't return the voice to the victim as one might have expected, because it is already the language of violence. So basically the violence is being reproduced. The violence of the event has been reproduced by the violence of the language, right? So maybe the parallelism between Bible and legal language concerns not sexuality but violence.
Thank you, Mark. I feel that it concerns youth and law, and the way they converge on kind of a search, an open search for equivalences for the bodily experiences, which of course include sexuality and violence. So when I spoke to Rita, she said, well, it's not Bible's content, it's not the what, but it's the how that seemed very appealing to her. And I think, yes, of course, kind of Bible writes in very Baroque ways, but what seems to me, as I suspect, is magnetic about his writing to her are instances where of the staging of writing, where in a way that famously kind of calls on the scenes of sexual exchange and financial exchange in forged documents. So I think there's something, so we can think about Bible's writing, let's say Guy de Maupassant's short story, where a moment of sexual initiation happens through translation, right? It is thanks to the text that is being translated by the two people that the sexual encounter happens. In Spravka, the scene of writing, of becoming a writer, it coincides with the scene of having a sexual encounter that is then interpreted as an encounter between lesbians. So I feel that it's those moments of where language and body become brought together and and narrated with a kind of transparency of the language of exchange, or the transparency of, let's say, the naivete of youth, which doesn't know the exact interpretation, or suspends the, let's say, the trauma of violence, or if there is any. That I feel like it's that puts them closer together, and the attraction to translation and to extending oneself through the interaction with foreign language and foreign culture, which I feel is very central for Lida.
Okay, thank you.
Ainsley, what do you think?
Yeah, I was thinking more about translation as well in relation to what I was talking about, because I think that it is significant. I think that some of the subtly unexpected uses of taboo words or foreign borrowings that we see in Yusupova, I think have very much to do as well with the experience of being what we maybe used to call an émigré poet, right? Although I think now we probably would be more inclined to just point to her as one of the many people writing in Russian all over the world. But I think that the estranging experience of living in different linguistic contexts, right, would make maybe a space of greater access to the dimensions of something like mat that is so socially predetermined in the way that it is usually used in a strictly Russophone context, like in Russia. but then when you take it out of that context, right, there is the opportunity for using it in a different way. But I have to say, as I was thinking about this and writing my presentation, I kept thinking about the Borges story about Pierre Menard, and the idea that you are doing the same thing, but it has so much different meaning, right? With the way that you might be using the standards of legal language or the standards of taboo language. So.
Yeah, I'll just like to add that I think, so in Lida and in Babil both, we have this desire to return to experiences of adolescent narrator. And I feel that maybe the tendency of adolescents to suspend judgment somehow works well with the, let's say, the need to pass judgment or to evaluate the act or the evidence in legal language. And I feel that the intuition between the two is present both in Babil and Lida, and that's what she responds to.
Do you mean though, like that? Do you mean a kind of a suspension of belief in the power of legal language, and the questioning that would go along with that? Is that?
Yes, that legal language opens the scene to questioning in a way that suspends, let's say, immediate emotional responses. It makes everything into evidence that needs to be questioned. And the ways of questioning are not readily prescribed. And I feel that there is that kind of freedom in youthful perception as well. And maybe that's why both Lida and Babil constantly return to both experiences of the youth and this moment of sort of legal judgment. And then choosing Babil as the sort of absentee father who both becomes an addressee, but also he's a forced father. So there is no authority, so everything is free. There.
Yeah, sorry, Mark.
May have another question. We have 2 minutes. It's rather a comment for Ainsley for your presentation. Very exciting presentation. Thank you. I think you touch very important questions here. But I'm thinking that in the way she employs absent words, Yusupova is following Fanailova. Because the example that you brought up, I think, директор Елена и люди, я не люблю слово фачить, мне гораздо ближе чистая бескомпромиссная ебля. So I think it all coming from the same source.
I had a note about that in my, I cut it for reasons of time. I think that there is like this sort of pra-mater Fanailova with her yeblia, right? I think that's definitely, she sort of almost has a ownership of this word in the Russian poetic context. But what I actually, if I can find my note about it, what struck me about it was actually the way I think Yusupova is using it differently. I think that the way Fanailova uses it is actually very much playing by the social rules dictated by the use of mat, right? She is contrasting her. It's a statement that I don't mind calling things what they are. I don't mind using this sort of aggressive word to describe what it is. Whereas I think that in the poem that I referred to, I think that Yusupova is suggesting that we think of yeblia as something outside of the taboo context, something beautiful, something positive, something lesbian. And I think in that sense, it's actually quite different. I think there is a implied reference to Fanailova, but then there's actually a contrast. It's a very important predecessor, though, to mention for sure. Should we conclude? So the plan is that we have a brief break and then we reconvene for our second session. So thank you very much to the presenters. Thank you to Mark. Thank you to our audience. Mark, do you have something else to conclude with?
No, thank you so much to you all. We have to make a break because every panel has a separate registration, so people have to re-enter. That's how we have designed it. So we'll see the The next session begins at 1:10, so we have a little bit more than 10 minutes to take a break. Thank you so much, and hope that that our wonderful audience will not abandon us, and we'll see you again. Thank you. Bye bye.